Here's exactly how I set up and use my iPad in the cockpit. I'll cover the iPad itself, the software I use, and then also a few pieces of additional hardware. First, I use the iPad mini. Now, when I started using the iPad in the cockpit about 6 years ago, I used my full-size iPad, which turned out to be entirely too big. It was a total bust. And it might seem like it might be nice to have that much screen real estate, but the truth is, you just simply don't need it. You don't need that much in my experience, and it just gets in the way. And furthermore, it was on a yoke mount, so it was very in the way on landing. So I would recommend the iPad mini. Now, don't let the term mini scare you. It's not like you're gonna have just a tiny little bit of screen real estate. You have to zoom in, you have to squint and everything. It's not that at all. In fact, I find that I've got more than enough screen real estate, and once you put it in the cockpit, space gets taken up very, very quickly. So I just find it's the perfect size. There's also the iPad Air, which is a few inches bigger on the screen size. Again, I just don't think it's necessary. I think it takes up a little bit too much space. So to each his own, but I love the iPad mini. Now, as for storage size, I've got 126 gigs on my iPad, and that's been way more than enough. But granted, I really only use my iPad for ForeFlight, so just plan accordingly if you've got it loaded up with a bunch of other stuff. But I'm really only using about 30% of my iPad's memory, and so I find it to be plenty. As another data point, Sporty's recommends an iPad with at least 64 gigs if you're gonna be using it in the cockpit. And then for cellular data versus Wi-Fi only, I actually do have the cellular data equipped version, but I've actually never even activated that function. I just didn't really want the added monthly expense. And I've always used Wi-Fi, and I find that I can still get it just about anywhere if you're flight planning. And in a pinch, I can just turn on a mobile hotspot with my phone and hook my iPad up to my phone in that way if I'm in a remote location or something and trying to file a flight plan. But honestly, even in that scenario, I'd probably just use ForeFlight on my phone, which does have cellular data. So I don't think the extra expense for equipping the iPad with cellular data is worth it. However, if you are a pro pilot and you're gonna be using it all the time everywhere and you don't have to constantly try to find Wi-Fi signal and stuff, I think it's totally worth it. Just for me, hadn't been worth it. Now, as for the software, I use and love ForeFlight. Now, there are different platforms that you can use, but honestly, ForeFlight, there's nothing I need ForeFlight to do that it doesn't do. And ever since they got acquired by Boeing, I really have found that the number of features they're constantly rolling out has just really, really accelerated. It is an awesome platform. I mean, go search around the internet. You won't find a single bad thing about it, except maybe it costs more than other platforms, but really you get what you pay for. It is stellar. Now, you can watch other videos on how to use ForeFlight, but it's really become an essential platform for everything for me. Everything from flight planning to IFR flight plan filing, weather briefing, weight and balance, navigation, situational awareness, in-flight weather and traffic information, geo-referenced approach plates, logbooks, I mean, so much more. It literally does everything. And while you still need to know how to do all this without your iPad, that's the way I learned without an iPad, you will quickly get spoiled once you start using ForeFlight. I mean, it is incredible. And the amount of information you have and the efficiency at which you can find it is really incredible. And I use it all the time for flight planning, and then in flight, I use a lot of things, but I especially rely on it for traffic, weather, and IFR approaches. And it is a game changer in all three of these areas. Now, in order to get that information in flight, like traffic and weather and some other things, you're gonna need an additional piece of hardware for that, because the iPad, whether or not you have cellular data or Wi-Fi only, it's not gonna be able to grab that. You need a unique piece of hardware that's going to be able to send the iPad that specific information. You'll need something like a Sentry or a Stratus, and I will link that down in the description. Now, it's an additional expense, but it's a complete no-brainer to have one of these in the cockpit. You'll be able to get some really valuable information like weather. You can get radar, which is, it's not technically radar. It's not like you have a radar pod on the aircraft that's sweeping the horizon and whatnot, but it's a little bit delayed, but some information is better than no information on weather. But what I really love using it for is that you can go grab METARs, TAFs, and winds aloft along your route of flight as you're flying. So instead of how it used to be where you would just grab all that information in your briefing and write it down and stuff, and then you really have no idea along your route of flight unless you were in range of listening to the ATIS or the AWAS and stuff. Now you can be scanning and just clicking on different airports all along your route of flight and see how the weather is changing. Is it changing? I love looking at the winds aloft along my route of flight and seeing, is there a better tailwind that I could get? Have things changed? Are they different than what they were forecasted to be? That's all super helpful information, and you get it literally sent to your iPad with you in the cockpit. I mean, it's really phenomenal. And then you get a lot of traffic information also off of ADS-B information. I won't get into all the complexities of ADS-B. It's a little confusing. I don't even fully understand it. But for any aircraft that is equipped with ADS-B, you will have the traffic information sent on your iPad. So it's not a radar where you're going to get everybody, but everyone who is equipped with ADS-B, which is pretty much everybody at this point, you'll have their location and information right there on your iPad. Now, the Sentry will do all of these things, and for what you're getting, it's not very expensive at all. I actually use a Stratus, and that's got a few more features features and it'll work with other platforms other than just ForeFlight. But honestly, the Sentry is a really, really great place to start. And they also just came out with a Sentry Mini, which is even more affordable, but it doesn't have its own internal battery, so it requires external power. So that's just something to be aware of. We're gonna be putting out an article over at airplaneacademy.com comparing all of these. And so when that's ready, I will put that down in the description. Now, it is worth noting here that you should always have a backup in the cockpit with you. So even as awesome and as reliable as the iPad is, you really need a backup. And that could be paper charts, but what I actually use is I just use my phone. I make sure that ForeFlight is up to date on my phone. It can still connect to the Stratus, the same as the iPad and everything, and that's my backup source for charts. But again, you could carry paper charts around with you if you want. The point is you just need to have some sort of backup in case your iPad goes out. Now, where and how do you mount the iPad? You really don't want it just floating around in the cockpit or sitting in the co-pilot seat. And I started off with a yoke mount, but I found that it got in the way, especially on landing and especially when I had a full-size iPad. Those two things didn't work well together. And so I ended up moving to a suction mount on the side of the windscreen and really, really love it. That's a great location. Although there isn't a ton of room there, which is why the iPad mini is my preference. And as for the mount itself, I used to use a mount that wasn't compatible with my case. So I just ended up using my iPad without a case, which in retrospect is a really bad idea because you run the risk of dropping and breaking your iPad on the ramp, which when you're counting on it on a cross-country trip, that just really messes you up. You just can't run that risk. But I recently found and love this new case and mount that are specifically built to go together. There's no compatibility issues. It's just awesome. It's sturdy. I use it in the cockpit now, and I cannot recommend it enough. And so in the video on the screen, I'm gonna tell you exactly how this works, why I love it so much, and where you can get it. So I'll see you over in that video.